War, and my dad used to give this talk, and when he quit doing it, I kind of inherited the obligation to do it. And I kind of say that I think when my father gave it, it was more interesting, but I think mine is more factual. But if the word holds, then you let me know. And then another factor in giving this talk is our law office was always downtown just for years and years and years, and I would have a lot of clients come in for a real estate closing or a will from Cape Coral or Estero or Bonita Springs, and they'd say, "This is the first time I've been to Fort Myers. It's such a nice, beautiful downtown." And then I'd go, "Well, that's where the fort was." And then they'd go, "What fort?" And that kind of opened the door for me to tell them the story, but it's just amazing how many people have absolutely no idea that we're Fort Myers, because there was an actual, genuine fort right here with real battles taking place. But having said that, first of all, I want to start this with a couple of trivia questions. The first one is, what is the largest city in the United States that's named for a Jewish West Point graduate? And the answer to that, none of you are going to give it to us. The answer of that is Abraham Myers. And here's how the fort got its name, and we're kind of skipping around in the narration a little bit. But Fort Myers was built in 1850. And at that time, a General Twiggs was the commander of all of the Army troops in Florida. And he had a daughter named Marion who was 15 years old, and she was engaged to Abraham Myers, who was 42. And I kind of imagine, they were having a Sunday dinner, all sitting at the table eating fried chicken and rice and gravy, and General Twiggs says, I've got to build a new fort down in southwest Florida, and I don't know what to name it. And I'm sure she said, "Daddy, name it after Abraham." But to his credit, he was really a decorated veteran from the Mexican War. So, it was naming it after him was really not a real improper thing to do. And let's see, and now that I've given him away, we'll click up if I'm doing this right. Come on, let's go to the next slide. Maybe not. Okay. Stephen, help. Okay, we'll try the keyboard. Okay. So I'm going to give this to you, and then you can just, every time I say next slide, you can hit it.
I'm not authorized.
Okay.
Is it hit next? Am I hitting too many keys?
Okay, yeah. Okay, there's. Which one does she get?
The arrow.
Next slide. Okay. And that's actually from the picture in the Historical Society. That's how the fort looked actually about 1850. It's on the bank of the river, and there's nothing around it. That was it. Okay, now hit it again, please. Okay, there we go. There's Abraham Myers. And fort gets named after him. In 1861, he resigns his commission as an United States Army officer and becomes Quartermaster General of the Confederacy, and apparently did an excellent job, except that his young wife Marion had the bad judgment to say some derogatory things about Jefferson Davis's wife, and that was the end of him being the Quartermaster General of the Confederacy. And he was so humiliated by that, actually after the war he moved to Germany and spent several years in Germany and came back. But kind of as an interesting side note, they had a son. His son joined the Marines, became a lieutenant colonel, was in charge of the Marines when the Boxer Revolution occurred, and the Marines held the embassy in Peking for I forget how many days. And I've also read something to say that the son also went on to become the commandant of the Marine Corps. So hopefully they he redeemed the family. Now here's our second trivia question. This one's a lot harder. What resident of Fort Myers was the Democratic nominee for president in 1880? Okay, nobody's going to guess on that. That was Winfield Scott Hancock. He was the quartermaster at Fort Myers during the 1850s when the Third Seminole Indian War was going on, and some of you will remember that he went on to really become the hero of Gettysburg, and he got the nickname of Hancock the Magnificent. And that's a burden to have a nickname like that. I'm glad you didn't introduce me as Hank the Magnificent. Thank you. Okay, so.
Well, we will now.
Anyway, not only, he was defeated by the Republican. And the Republican was James Garfield, and this leads to another Civil War story, and also ties up with another officer from Fort Myers. During the Battle of Chickamauga, which is right south of Chattanooga, first day of the battle, General Rosecrans, who was the overall Union commander of the Army of the Cumberland, he chewed out one of his subordinate generals in front of all the other generals. Second day, one of Rosecrans' staff officers is riding along, sees a section of woods, and there's no Union troops there. Well, actually, the woods are so thick he couldn't see the Union troops. But he goes and tells General Rosecrans there's a section of the line and we don't have any troops in it. So Rosecrans sends the order to this general that he chewed out, move your troops up and cover that gap. Well, that general knew there was no gap there, but after Rosecrans had chewed him out, he goes, well, whatever General Rosecrans wants, I'm going to give it to him. So he moves his troops and opens a gap in the line. And then when Confederate General Longstreet attacks, he suddenly realizes there's one point in the Union line where nobody's shooting at him, and so he starts pouring all of his men through that gap. And pretty soon, Confederate soldiers are appearing behind the Union lines, and another officer rides up to Rosecrans and yells, General, the Rebs have broken through, what are we going to do? And at that point, Rosecrans goes, it's every man for himself, and he gallops off the field. His staff gallops off the field, and when the Union soldiers are seeing their generals riding off the field, they just all throw down their rifles and begin to run. And so at that point, another officer who was stationed at Fort Myers during the Seminole Indian Wars was George Thomas, and he just starts grabbing every Union soldier he can get, whether it's one or a whole company of 200, and he eventually accumulates about 20,000 men. They get on top of Horseshoe Ridge, and they hold that position for the next 6 hours while Longstreet throws 65,000 men against them. And if Thomas had not done that, probably, the entire Army of the Cumberland might have been wiped out. But anyway, let's get back to Garfield. Garfield's an aide to Rosecrans. They're back on the outskirts of Chattanooga. Rosecrans turns, looks around through his binoculars, and goes, what's that fool Thomas doing? I ordered a retreat. Go tell Thomas we're retreating. So Rosecrans gallops out there, looks over the situation. Garfield rides out there, looks over the situation, rapidly scribbles a little note, gives it to some, I call him the luckiest private in the Union Army, says, take my horse, get off this battlefield, and take this to General Rosecrans. Well, Rosecrans looks at the note, kind of goes, wads it up, throws it on the floor. Newspaper reporter picks it up, and he reads it. And that note from Garfield says, Thomas is holding like a rock, and I'm staying with him. And the reporter immediately rapidly scratches out a story, runs to the telegraph office, puts it on the wire, and the entire nation hears about it. Thomas is a hero and becomes called the Rock of Chickamauga, and Rosecrans is disgraced. But that's just kind of another interesting link to the soldiers that were stationed in Fort Myers over the years. Cindy, click it again, please. There's Hancock, and we used to have, I don't know whether he was a docent, a volunteer, or what, at the old historical museum, which is right here, when it was the museum, named Stan Mulford. And Stan actually got together a list of over 100 soldiers who were stationed in Fort Myers during the Third Seminole Indian War that went on to become generals either for the North or the South. And then one more general we ought to mention was Stonewall Jackson. He was stationed at Fort Meade and got orders to report down here to Fort Myers. And there was another officer who, I guess his name is lost to history now, But Jackson didn't like him, and rather than come to Fort Myers and have to deal with him, he retired from the Army, went to Virginia Military Institute and taught there until the Civil War broke out, and then became a very famous general in his own right. But But to lay the groundwork, next thing I want to do is kind of lay the groundwork as to how we ended up with the fort in Fort Myers. And to kind of do that, we got to go back first to the French and Indian War. And that was a battle between Britain. It was really a worldwide battle, a battle between Britain and France and Spain. And when that war ended, Britain had captured Havana from Spain, and when they're negotiating the peace treaty, Spain's kind of going, hey, we really want Havana back. It's our capital over here in the New World. And England said, well, you got to give us something, or we're not going to give Havana up. And Spain goes, well, how'd you like Florida? Yeah, we'll take Florida. So then Spanish gets Havana back, British get Florida. Then during the Revolutionary War, Spain used Florida as a base of operations, really, for all the fighting in Georgia and the Carolinas. Then, when that peace treaty is negotiated, Spain and France are on the winning side with the American patriots, and they're negotiating the peace treaty with Britain. And at that point, Spain says, hey, Britain, you know, we won this war fair and square. We want Florida back. And Britain says, well, you got to give us something. And Spain says, well, if you give us Florida, we'll give you the Rock of Gibraltar. And Spain goes, hey, that's a good deal. We've always wanted the Rock of Gibraltar. And so then Florida becomes Spanish again. And through all these different wars going on, Florida was, whoever had Florida kind of offered it as a refuge. So a lot of Indians that were getting dispossessed from the 13 colonies and forced out, they ended up in Florida. A lot of runaway slaves ended up here in Florida because Spain had abolished slavery a lot earlier than Britain did. And if you arrived in Florida and were willing to become Catholic and swear an oath of allegiance to the King of Spain, you were in. So anyway, that's how so many of the Indians arrived here. I mean, the Seminoles never really existed as a tribe until all these other tribes that have been forced out of the 13 colonies came on down here, and they kind of jumbled together. And I'm going to badly mispronounce this, but there was a Spanish word sort of like Cimarrones, which meant others, because you were either Catholic in Spanish or you were an other, and that's gotten kind of anglicized over the world over the years into Seminoles. And now I'm going to jump ahead to the start of the Civil War here in Florida. Back after the Florida signed their secession resolutions, the Confederates in Florida started seizing federal properties all over. Hold a minute here. I missed a step. Excuse me. Yeah. So anyway, we're moving ahead to the Seminole Indian Wars, and in 1816, that's when the first Seminole Indian War started. Andrew Jackson was chasing Indians out of Georgia and back into Florida, and I need to mention that basically all of the wars in Florida have involved cattle, and settlers in Georgia were coming into Florida and stealing the Indians' cows. The Indians were going up into Georgia and stealing the settlers' cows, and Andrew Jackson when he was a general, got tasked with chasing those Creek Indians out of Georgia and back into Florida. And so 1816, Jackson chases a band of Indians down into Florida. He arrives in Florida, decides that the Spanish are giving the Indians sanctuary, and he ends up burning the Spanish capital, which is about where Tallahassee is now, which displeased Spain. Then Jackson finds out over in the Apalachicola area that there's some British Army veterans, and they've got a trading post, and they're selling guns to the Indians. And so Jackson goes over there and hangs those English traders, and we've got an international incident on our hands. Britain and Spain are both very upset with us, but fortunately they've been worn out by all the previous wars. They really don't want another war over in America. And finally the United States in 1821 says, hey Spain, how about if we just buy Florida? And Spain says, that's fine, we don't have to go to war. So at that point, Florida becomes a U.S. territory. And then we negotiate a peace treaty with the Indians. Cindy, hit it again. Let's see what we have coming up next. Okay, there we are. Hit it again. Hit it again. Okay. There's a map of. I'm going to play with the laser pointer now. Let's see here. Is it going? Yeah, there we go. Anyway, they negotiate a peace treaty with the Indians, and they get this big tract of land as the Indian reservation. And unfortunately for the Indians, in 1830, Jackson is president, and he gets the Indian Removal Act passed, and is telling the Indians they've all got to move out. And at that point, Osceola, who's been dealing with the Indian agent who was Wiley Thompson up in Gainesville, ends up killing Wiley Thompson. And then when the army, which is down at Fort Brooke here in Tampa, finds out that the Indians have Fort King surrounded, they send Major Dade and his column of troops up to relieve the siege on Fort King. And then Wildcat, whose Indian name was something like, I can't say these Indian names, I apologize to the Indian. Something like Kulachi. If Woody Hanson were here, he could tell us. But anyway, they ambush Major Dade and kill all but two of his soldiers, and one dies later, and the other one crawls all the way back to Tampa, and that was probably about half of the U.S. Army troops stationed in Florida at the time. Another Indian war is on. In 1839, it's beginning to wind down, and they open up a trading post for the Indians at Harney Point, which is now Cape Coral. Well, the Indians are suspicious because Major Harney is there with about 26 soldiers and only 2 or 3 traders, and so about 200 combined tribes of Indians attack there and kill everybody but Major Dade and Major Harney and about 6 of the soldiers who escaped by jumping into the Caloosahatchee River and swimming across to this bank. So the war revs back up, and then finally the Indians and the Army get tired of it, and they pay the Indians an enormous amount of money to move to Kansas, and that's the end of the Second Seminole Indian War. And then, as part of that treaty, let's see here, they get, this is their new reservation, which, includes Sanibel and Captiva and all of Southwest Florida. And so and that war was over in 1842, but more settlers are moving into Florida, and there's bad interactions between the Indians and the settlers, again involving cattle among other things, and Indians are beginning to burn down settlers' cabins all over the state, and so they decide in 1850 they had better build Fort Myers right here to keep an eye on the Indians. And then more orders come down to tell the Indians they've got to move out west. And the Army begins patrols into the Everglades here looking for Indians and telling them they've got to move. And at that time, Billy Bowlegs was the leader of the Indians, and the story I've heard, which may not be true, but it's a good story, is he kept moving his band of warriors around as the Army went through there until they found his village deep in the Everglades. And according to legend, the Indians weren't there. They'd all been hidden, but they found Billy Bowlegs' banana patch, and they chopped down his banana patch, and at that point he said, "This is war." And so for 3 years of fighting between 55 and 58, they chase him around for a while, and then finally pay him and all of his warriors exorbitant sums of money, and they all agree to leave. And that left about 100 to 200 Indians deep in the Everglades, which were the kernel of today's Seminole tribe. But again, with this war, there was a lot of interesting connections that kind of relate back to Fort Myers. Manuel Gonzalez was ran the mail boat, and after the Civil War and after the fort was abandoned, then Manuel Gonzalez and his son-in-law Vivas, they were the first family to move into Fort Myers. And of course, Woody Hanson, several generations, is the result of the Gonzalez's moving into Fort Myers. Then McKay, a guy named McKay, was the sutler at the fort, and he also had a fleet of sailing ships, and he ended up partnering after 1858, partnering with Captain Hendry and Jacob Summerlin, and they were using his ships to transport the cattle to Cuba. And then McKay moved to Tampa and ended up becoming mayor of Cuba. And then when we come back, we'll mention him again when we get to the Civil War. Okay, now we're ready to start talking about the Civil War. As soon as the succession document is signed, Confederates all over the state start seizing Union. Yeah, let's click past that one. That was the first reservation. There's Osceola. There's the Dade Massacre that started the Second Seminole Indian War.
We need to beat that man.
Okay, well, I don't remember. It's been long enough. I don't remember what's in order. So click back to the Dade Massacre picture for a minute. Just to tell you an interesting story. The artist of that picture is a guy named Jackson Walker, and he's a member of the Seminole Foundation too. And I got a copy of this picture and had it framed and had it hanging in my office for a long time. Except my wife absolutely hated it. And so I'm telling Jackson that I've got this picture hanging in my office, and his face lights up. And then I tell him my wife hates it, and his face drops. And then he says, "Why?" And I said, "Because she doesn't want to look at the terror in the eyes of the soldiers and the horses and seeing everybody dying." And he goes, "Wait a minute, that's a compliment, isn't it?" And I go, "Yes." So move ahead, please, for me, Cindy. Okay, there's Harney after he became, and to tell you about the massacre, the day of the massacre, Harney had gone to Sanibel Island to hunt wild hogs. He came home real tired and didn't make sure that the guards were out. So when the Indians attacked, all the soldiers were asleep. So a lot of them were killed before they could even get to their weapons, okay? And after that, he badly hated Seminole Indians, and whenever he captured any alive, he hung them. So he was just not a real nice man. Okay, let's click past this, please. Okay, we can click past that one. We don't need it either. Click it again, please, Cindy. We don't need that map either. We don't need that one. Okay, there's a picture of one of the blockhouses at Fort Myers in the 1850s. Let's go to the next one. And this is kind of interesting. This is city engineers got this together a number of years ago. This is an overlay of the fort on downtown Fort Myers. And you can see it kind of runs from Monroe Street on up here. This is 2nd Street along here, and then down about to where Fowler is. And so all of this land here, and that was the riverbank back in those days. And all of this out here where Edwards Drive is, Bay Street, the yacht basin, that's all filled in land. So anyway, like I said, the fort really just sits right on top of downtown Fort Myers. Let's see here. Okay, so here we're at the Civil War. And basically when the Civil War starts, since secessionists seized most of the federal facilities in Florida, the only thing still in Union hands was, we got, Cindy, click it again, please. We got Fort Taylor at Key West, go back again now. And then, okay, which was down here at Key West. Click it again, please. And hit it again. And then we have Fort Pickens at Pensacola. And then we had Fort Jefferson, which is way out in the Dry Tortugas. Those were the only Union facilities left, and Pickens and Fort Taylor remained in Union hands simply because the commanders of those forts, the secessionists, demanded that the fort surrender, and the commanders of the forts pulled up the drawbridges and said, we're not surrendering without a fight. And at that point in the war, Confederates didn't have the weapons to take on a major fort like that. So those were the only federal facilities remaining. So there wasn't much of a Union presence in Florida at that time. And there were an awful lot of people who were in Florida, because Florida at that point was one of the wildest undeveloped areas east of the Mississippi, and there were really a lot of people here that really were here just because they didn't really want to be involved in the war and were kind of sitting it out. And to